Think about the last time you replayed a conversation in your head, hours after it ended, searching for hidden meaning in a sentence that probably meant nothing at all. Maybe it was a text that felt slightly off, a tone that seemed different, a comment you couldn't stop dissecting, turning over, trying to figure out what it really meant. Most people think overthinking is just a personality trait, something anxious minds do, harmless in the end. But overthinking isn't neutral. It creates a very specific kind of vulnerability, one that certain people can sense almost immediately, and once they sense it, they know exactly how to use it. Here's what most people never realize. Manipulation doesn't usually target people who are naive. It targets people whose minds are already working overtime, because an overactive mind is far easier to redirect than a calm one. If you're already searching for meanings, someone else only has to point you in a direction. They don't need to convince you of much. Your own thinking does the rest of the work for them. This connects to something called cognitive load, the mental bandwidth available to process and evaluate information at any given moment. Overthinkers tend to operate with much of that bandwidth already occupied, replaying past conversations, anticipating future ones, analyzing tone, rehearsing responses. When someone with less mental noise interacts with you, they have far more capacity left over to observe, to notice inconsistencies, to think clearly under pressure. An overthinker, already stretched thin, has less room left to catch the very thing they're most afraid of missing. And it gets even more interesting than that, because overthinking doesn't just consume mental space. It actively invites certain kinds of manipulation, specifically the kind built on ambiguity. Someone who wants to manipulate an overthinker doesn't need to lie outright. They just need to stay vague, a half answer, a mixed signal, an unclear response to a direct question. To a calm mind, ambiguity is often just an incomplete answer, easily addressed by asking again. To an overthinking mind, ambiguity becomes a project, something to solve, alone, for hours, usually landing on an interpretation far more generous to the other person than the situation deserves. This is where almost everyone makes the same mistake. They assume that thinking harder about a situation will eventually produce clarity. But manipulation thrives specifically in this loop because the overthinker isn't examining what actually happened. They're examining every possible version of what could have happened. And manipulators, whether consciously or not, learn to exploit exactly that tendency. They don't need to manage your perception. You're already doing it for them. There's also a deeper mechanism at work here, related to cognitive dissonance. When someone's actions don't match their words, a calm mind tends to notice the gap immediately and treat it as information. An overthinking mind often does something different. It works to resolve the discomfort of that gap internally, usually by inventing a reasonable explanation for the other person's behavior, rather than simply accepting that the behavior itself was the problem. This isn't weakness. It's the brain's attempt to reduce internal conflict as quickly as possible. But it means the overthinker frequently ends up defending the very behavior that should have raised concern in the first place. So how does someone stop this pattern from being used against them? It comes down to 3 shifts. The first is treating ambiguity as information, not as a puzzle. When someone gives a vague or inconsistent answer, the instinct is to fill in the gap with the most charitable explanation possible. But an unclear answer to a direct question is already an answer. It tells you something about how much clarity that person is willing to offer you. Learning to sit with that, instead of immediately explaining it away, removes one of the primary tools manipulation depends on. The second is limiting the number of times a situation gets replayed before a decision is made. This taps into emotional regulation, specifically the difference between thinking something through once carefully and thinking about it repeatedly without new information. After a certain point, replaying a conversation doesn't produce new insight. It only produces new interpretations, most of which say more about your own anxiety than about what actually happened. Setting an internal limit, 1 honest pass, not 50, protects against the kind of spiraling that manipulators rely on to keep you occupied and off balance. The third is asking directly instead of analyzing silently. Overthinkers often believe that if they just think about something long enough, they'll arrive at the truth on their own. But truth, in most interpersonal situations, isn't something you deduce in isolation. It's something you get by asking a clear question and paying close attention to whether the answer is direct or evasive. This single behavior, asking instead of assuming, removes the ambiguity a manipulator needs to operate because it forces a specific response instead of leaving space for your imagination to fill in the blanks. There's a reason this pattern is so difficult to break, and it isn't really about intelligence. Overthinkers are often deeply perceptive people, sensitive to nuance, genuinely trying to understand others accurately. But that same sensitivity, without boundaries around it, becomes an opening. Not because something is wrong with the way they think, but because their thinking was never given permission to stop before reaching a conclusion. Manipulation doesn't succeed by being more convincing than the truth. It succeeds by finding a mind already willing to do the convincing on its own behalf. The moment that mind learns to ask instead of assume, to notice ambiguity instead of resolving it internally, the entire dynamic loses the one thing it depended on most. True power is rarely about controlling other people. It's about controlling yourself. If you want to keep learning how the mind can be used against itself, and how to protect your own thinking from manipulation, consider subscribing. There's a lot more beneath the surface of overthinking than most people ever realize.